for a limited time.
As I mentioned, politicians from all around the country winging their way into Canberra tonight in their business class seats. Assistant Treasurer Josh Frydenberg was among them. I caught up with him earlier this evening. Welcome back to Viewpoint, Josh Frydenberg.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
Josh, I wonder if you can tell us whether politicians' entitlements are one of the biggest issues facing the country, or whether we've just wasted the last month of national political debate.
Well, certainly it's been disappointing to see so much of the Nationals' political discourse taken up by the discussion about entitlements, but I can understand that the public do want reform. There is a need for reform, and that's why the Prime Minister has committed to this root and branch review with a panel of eminent experts to make recommendations to the government.
Of course, we wouldn't have had this debilitating debate if politicians from both sides hadn't been indulging themselves so extravagantly.
Well, certainly there have been some examples of unacceptable conduct. At the same time, a lot of the lines are blurred. But we'll get some proper reform, and we can hopefully now get some clear air to debate the real issues facing Australia, namely economic security and national security. And certainly now that we're back in Parliament from tomorrow, we'll be discussing issues like tax reform, industrial relations reform, the importance of the China-Australia free trade agreement.
I'll come to those issues in a moment. I'll come to those issues in a moment, Josh Frydenberg, but first up on the issue of entitlements, Bronwyn Bishop as Speaker did not get much support from her own colleagues, even though, as we now know, many of those same colleagues had very extravagant entitlement claims themselves. Why wasn't she backed in by her own side?
Well, I think Bronwyn's the first to admit that taking the helicopter was unacceptable, and, you know, probably the mea culpa should have come earlier than it did. But she's also taken the decision in the best interest of the party to resign her position, and tomorrow we elect a new Speaker. But we all move on, and I know that we are a team, a cohesive team, and hopefully this entitlements issue can be put behind us.
You've said previously that Tony Burke, the lead Labor accuser on this issue, that he's a hypocrite because of the extravagant entitlement claims we've seen from him. Will you pursue him in the Parliament and in the public debate? Do you think he should resign?
Look, that's an issue for Tony Burke, but certainly it was a bit odd for him to be the chief attack dog on Bronwyn Bishop.
But will the government target him? You say it's up to him. Will the government target him in the same way that Labor targeted and harangued Bronwyn Bishop?
Well, Tony Burke's accountable to the Australian people, like we all are, for his expenses, and he has started to pay back some of those expenses. But, you know, certainly if there are more questions for him to answer, we would hope that he answers them, Chris.
But it sounds like he's not going to come under much pressure. I mean, in effect, Labor has called the government's bluff here, haven't they? They've run this campaign against Bronwyn Bishop. The media jumped in very strongly with them. They got their scalp. Now everyone's going to back away because everyone's in strife. You don't want to go down a path of mutually assured destruction.
Well, it certainly was pretty convenient for the Labor Party to turn their attention on Bronwyn Bishop, because at that time Bill Shorten was under enormous pressure at the Royal Commission, where his evidence was called into question for its credibility. He also was facing a national conference where him and Tanya Plibersek were going head-to-head on issues like gay marriage and on the boats issue. His party is all at sea on climate change, you know, coming up with a policy on the run about renewable energy. So clearly he had his own problems, and it suited the Labor Party very well to turn their attention on Bronwyn Bishop. But now we are the government, and we've got a job to do in prosecuting a broader economic and national security agenda.
Well, first up, before you do that, you need to get a new Speaker for the House of Representatives tomorrow. Who are you backing in for that Speaker's job?
I've made it very clear to my colleagues that I'm backing my fellow Victorian Tony Smith. I think he's well credentialed with more than a decade experience in the Parliament, chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. That being said, there are a number of very good candidates in the field with Andrew Southcott and Ross Vasta and Russell Broadbent also putting their hands up, and we'll see who else tomorrow. And this is a decision that my colleagues will make, and each of them are entitled to have that vote.
Should Bronwyn Bishop and Phil Ruddock and possibly others, but certainly those two, announce that they are not going to contest their seats at the next election? Can the government afford to have two people in their 70s going around again, especially when they've had their time as Speaker and senior ministers, and they're obviously in the twilight of their career? You don't really want to, as a government, look like you're just giving people like that another run around the park.
Well, certainly we're not giving people like that another run around the park for the sake of it. I mean, in terms of, Philip Ruddock, he's continued to make an extremely important contribution to the Parliament, most recently in this debate about taking away the dual citizenship of people who are engaged in terrorist offences abroad. In terms of Bronwyn Bishop, she's made a long and distinguished commitment and contribution to the Australian Parliament. I don't think it's fair of my colleagues or commentators or people opposite to tell them when and how they should go. That's a decision that they will make in their own consciences, in their own time, and certainly in consultation with their constituents. But I think Philip and Bronwyn still have major contributions to make.
All right, even if that means being re-elected at the next election, we'll see how all that pans out. But as you say, this has been a distraction from the government's agenda over the past month. You ended the parliamentary term going into the winter recess in good shape and Labor on the ropes, but this has certainly thrown the government off message over the past month or so. You've talked earlier in this interview about the need for economic security and national security issues to come through. What is the core of the government's agenda? What the Abbott coalition agenda? What is its core agenda? What are you asking the Australian public to come on board with you and back you in for in terms of re-election?
It's about growing the economy and jobs. At the end of the day, that's what everything we're doing in pursuing economic security is all about. And that's why I was very pleased with the very positive response to this year's budget, particularly the focus, Chris, on small business and the accelerated depreciation allowance and the tax cut for more than 96% of Australian businesses, more than 2 million small businesses. And in fact, there's some very positive signs across the economy. The Labor Party likes to talk down the economy. We want to actually focus on what has been achieved. We've seen business confidence now at its highest level in 2 years. We've seen job advertisements at their highest level in 3 years. Export volumes are up 8% year on year. Building construction approvals are up 17% year on year. We've now got the free trade agreement.
We've also just seen the Reserve Bank downgrade its economic growth forecast in the coming years. And we've heard the arguments made by the government itself, by the Treasurer and the Prime Minister, that there needs to be ongoing economic reform in Australia. You've talked about federation reform, you've talked about taxation reform, you've talked about industrial relations reform, but you're not backing in any specific measures at the moment. You're knocking out all specific measures that are raised. There's a sense of frustration around the business community and the population more broadly that you don't have a reform agenda laid out before the public.
Well, firstly, in terms of the jobs of the future, they're going to be connected to the big economies in our region, and I think a great success of this government has been those 3 free trade agreements, and now we've seen a point of division between us and the Labor Party on the biggest one of all, that is namely with China, where we will see 15,000 jobs created over the next few years and a massive boost to GDP and economic growth by getting a ride from the largest economy in our region.
That's fine.
That will be a point of discussion.
But what is the agenda that you'll take to the election? Do you not agree that this government, the Abbott coalition government, must take some reform to the next election? You didn't take it to the last election. You dropped it on people in the budget, and we all saw how that turned out. Don't you need to take the public into your confidence with a reform agenda over the next 12 months And is that going to be in industrial relations, or is it going to be in taxation reform, or is it going to be in both?
I think it will be in both, and I think what we've got now from the Productivity Commission is a suggestion about a number of changes that they would like to see in the industrial relations space. We continue to call for the reintroduction of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, which is effectively a cop on the beat, which delivered a productivity dividend worth $6 billion a year to the economy when it was put in before Labor removed it. When it comes to tax reform, as you know, we put out our discussion paper. We're very pleased to see the states have this debate about the GST because they're the greatest beneficiaries of it. But we have said this country needs wholesale tax reform, and that's why we have a long runway between now and the next election to discuss alternatives for reform. When you talk about that free trade agreement, it's all not locked and loaded because the Labor Party is refusing to support the China-Australia free trade agreement despite the clear benefits that will accrue to the Australian public. They're running the union scaremongering, xenophobic campaign. So that's still unfinished business. So, and in my particular space, working with the Treasurer on David Murray's financial systems inquiry, we'll have more to say soon about implementation of reforms that flow from that. And Bruce Bilson's been doing a lot of work on competition reform coming out of the Harper Review. So there's a lot that is taking place within the government about economic reform, and we'll continue to make the case for budget repair as well as more broadly tax and industrial relations reform.
Just generally on economic growth, I want to talk to you about the coal industry. We've got two major mining projects in jeopardy in Australia at the moment, one in New South Wales, one in Queensland, held up by the courts, and also a lot of community protests that are run very, very fervently through the ABC. The national broadcaster seems to be the place of choice if you want to oppose development in this country. And I noticed on the ABC this morning, Richard Di Natale, the Greens leader, talking about the coal industry as a 19th century industry. Now, we know, of course, it's our second largest export, coal, and it provides close to 70% of the nation's electricity, employs tens of thousands of people. Is the coalition government prepared to actually fight on the side of coal in the lead up to the election? Because it seems to me that certainly the Greens and to a large extent the Labor Party are trying to say that the coal industry is a bad industry.
Well, certainly we are prepared to defend the coal industry and defend it as being an important part of Australia's energy mix. As you say, it earns tens of billions of dollars in export income for this country. It actually employs more than 100,000 Australians directly and indirectly. It's responsible for around 50% of our energy that we produce here domestically, and globally coal is responsible for more than 40% of the world's energy needs. And when you consider that there are more than 1 billion people, Chris, who don't have access to electricity, many in the developing world, coal is a great answer to their problem. And so therefore the Greens really need to understand how important coal is to the broader energy mix in Australia, how important it is to jobs, but also how important it is in the developing world to give people a better life that they currently enjoy here in Australia.
I think my point is that not only the Greens need to wake up to this, we perhaps know that the Greens will never wake up to that, but perhaps the national broadcaster might wake up to what are the key industries in the Australian economy and globally, because that statement was just not challenged on the ABC today. Now, I know you're going to break the government's boycott of the ABC's Q&A program tomorrow night. You're the first minister going into the lion's den. Are you going to take up the ABC on their political bias? Are you going to take it up to them on that issue of political bias?
Well, certainly we don't resolve from the fact that we haven't had ministers appear for some weeks on Q&A, because the performance of that show in allowing Zaki Mallah a national stage to promote his extremist views was completely unacceptable. And we're very pleased that the ABC hierarchy have listened to our concerns, have now responded, and the Q&A will come under the broader remit of the News and Current Affair Division. But if you ask me about the need for even-handedness on the ABC, absolutely. I've always said that they need a broader range of commentators to reflect reflect a broader range of views in the community, but we do not resolve from the fact that we took very strong action on the about the Q&A program in particular.
Well, you have fun there tomorrow night. We'll be busy watching Paul Murray live on Sky News. But my only tip, my only one tip for Q&A is do not arrive in a helicopter.
No, I won't be. Thanks very much. And I won't be walking though either.
No, thanks very much, Josh Frydenberg.
All the best. Bye, Chris.
Josh Frydenberg there. Of course, you don't need to watch Q&A tomorrow night because you've heard it all from Josh there directly, and you can watch Paul Murray live tomorrow night. A couple of interesting points there from Josh Frydenberg. In particular, I thought, saying very clearly that the government will take taxation and industrial relations reform to the next election. Now, I think they've really got to start detailing what they're going to take to the election because they need to take the public with them. We've seen what Labor have done on their key policies, on boats, on budget measures and on climate policy. Labor are going out of their way to make themselves unelectable, in my view. So it's high time we started to hear more from the government about what their plans are so they can draw out that contrast. I'll take up that issue and lots more with the panel after this break.